Okay, we'll talk about spoilers.
What do you see that I don't? Show me. Where did you go?
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Last week I published a review of Weapons after watching that film at an early press screening, and I deliberately omitted sharing any spoiler-ridden details because the story is one that really needs to be experienced unspoiled. A major part of how you follow that story is watching this mystery gradually be established, and then bit by bit the truth of what's really going on gets revealed. A couple of people had requested that I revisit the film with spoilers once they had been able to go and see the full roller coaster ride that is Weapons on opening weekend, so I figured we might as well circle back. Just so we're very clear here, this is not a spoiler video designed for people who have not watched the film. I will not be explaining everything in the story because I still feel very strongly that if you would like to engage with the film, first and foremost, you need to go and watch the film at the cinema before engaging with any discussions of the material. If you haven't seen the film and would still like to try to follow along, of course you are free to do so, but I am going to jump around to a number of different things. I went and saw the film a second time to try to see what other details I might pick up on after already having seen the full mystery play out and be revealed, but I only want to hone in on a couple of details. The opening voiceover speaks from the perspective of being 2 years out from the events of the film. And this voiceover comes from a child who says that the police were so embarrassed that they weren't able to solve this case that they ended up covering everything up. And this is one of the things that sparked my reflections on the anti-police sentiments spanning Zach Cregger's 2 feature films, because yes, I'm also going to include a bit of Barbarian in this discussion, so spoiler warning for that film as well. In Barbarian, when Tess escapes the house and asks for help, she's distressed and also covered in some dirt and grime because of the environmental conditions of where she was being held hostage, so she spots police, asks for help, and they are completely dismissive of her. There's definitely a racial component worth considering when examining that exchange, not only because of Tess, but also because of the film making a point of showing how the place where she was being held hostage used to be part of an either predominantly or entirely white suburban neighborhood that has now devolved into being a completely run-down part of Detroit. Circling back to Weapons, the film makes a point of showing the police as being both corrupt and immoral. Paul assaults a handcuffed James when he pricks his finger, and when he realizes that this assault had been caught on his car's camera, he tells his father-in-law, who is his professional superior at the police station. Together, they conspire to cover up that misconduct. Moreover, the police are not heroes in any way, shape, or form in this story. They are not the ones to solve the case, and they are not the ones to find or free the children. Now, put a pin in that. I will return to this attitude of Zach Cregger's storytelling towards the police as an institution, but we have some other things to go through first. In my first Weapons review, I made a comparison to the film Parasite. I had been talking about how Parasite was a film which asked early viewers, critics, film festival attendees to not spoil that mystery and all that gets revealed when making your way through that film. I felt that Weapons had a similar concept, broadly speaking, where it's a story best experienced unspoiled because the thrill of the first watch simply doesn't hit the same if you already know what's going to be revealed in the end. Upon watching Weapons for a second time, I was intrigued to pick up on the extra details of how Miss Gandy is teaching her students about parasites. You can see information about that topic written on the whiteboard of her classroom, and you also hear her talking about them in one of the classroom scenes. Then, when we are in Marcus's home and he's just trying to enjoy his day with his husband, but that was before Zach Cregger's Pennywise showed up. Don't worry, we will talk about that, just please wait a moment. Before that, the program they're watching on television is about a fungus or something like that, which is sprouting from an ant's head. And there's a line that mentions something about how it will then be used to find more ants. Hello? Symbolism? Foreshadowing? Anyone? So it was very easy for me to interpret this art as being even more like Parasite than I had originally meant in my first review, because this whole concept of parasites consuming and using others for their own will, it's a means of showing you what the film Weapons is about and what the story's central villain is doing. But it could also be interpreted as being representative of an oppressive power dynamic of systemic inequality. Before I continue talking about some of my points of feedback, I do want to make it clear that I am presenting more of my own interpretation of this art, and I am not necessarily making a claim that my interpretation is 100% exactly what Zach Cregger intended when he made the story. I don't know nearly enough about him to make a deeply discerning analysis about what his full ideological makeup is. This video is more so meant to be like a book club where we all read the same book and now we are presenting how we experienced that story, the things that stood out to us, and how we are interpreting all of those things. So the idea that this parasitic motif we see could be representative of systemic inequality also ties into the gaps we see presented between different generations. Before I start to elaborate on this, I want to make it very clear that I'm not aiming to perpetuate any unfair ageism, but if you place the main villain of Weapons as the representation of the oldest generation, it's not about overly generalizing everyone in that age range as being the source of the world's misery, but more so that the architects of the worst things that are negatively impacting everyone and everything on this planet are from older generations. Gladys, she is only interested in using and consuming anyone and everyone that will help herself. It doesn't matter how badly those people are hurt in the process. From that perspective, you can apply that to any major problem that impacts the world. The military-industrial complex, oil pollution, the plastic industry, a multitude of deregulations that allow a select few, namely the architects of the world's misery, to hoard and consolidate resources, money, and power. Basically, not all old people are bad, but the negative symptoms we are seeing now are the results of decisions made by people long ago. So to put it colloquially, old people. Then we move to the middle generation of Weapons. These are the various adult characters we see, such as Justine, Archer, Paul, and even James, though he's definitely younger than the rest of the adults in that middle generation bracket. Let's go through a couple of these. Archer is the father of Matthew, who was shown to be a bully before he disappeared with the other school children. Archer expresses a lot of guilt and remorse over not explicitly telling his son that he loves him. I interpreted that detail as being a reflection of this generational gap often observed where you have people, and I don't know exactly when it starts, but maybe we'll say mid to younger millennials and younger, who are going out of their way to try to practice things like gentle parenting, as they tend to be a lot more understanding and aware of harmful patterns of behavior and manner of thinking that are passed down from one generation to the next. This particular subtext of Archer and Matthew's story feels very clear. His lack of emotional care for his son, his inability to express love and affection, which is something fundamental to a child's health, has resulted in his son having a lack of emotional care, hence Matthew being a bully at school. Furthermore, within this middle generation of adult characters, there's this recurring presence of unhealthy coping mechanisms, overly partaking in or even addiction to various substances. We see James, who is an addict and he lives on the streets. Paul is someone who struggles with sobriety, and Justine drinks a lot. We repeatedly see her buying and serving herself alcohol. They don't give you the full backstory of why all of those characters began to use those substances, but they're very noticeable all across the story. To me, that indicates a lack of health in that generation, as they have been battered by the unhealthy world created by the generation or generations which came before them. However, this adult generation is also presented through a more nuanced lens. They're not completely irredeemable like the central villain Gladys is. Archer visits one of the missing children's parents, Erica, and he asks to look at the surveillance footage they have as part of this investigation he's doing himself to try to find where the children went, because at this point, he has already figured out that the cops are useless and will not be the ones to solve the case and find the missing children, including his son Matthew. When Archer first asks Erica if he can see the footage, she says no. She's not comfortable with that. So Archer waits for her husband Cary to come home and asks him, and that is how he's able to access the footage. He did need to see the footage to help him make progress in this investigation, but keep in mind here that they could have just as easily written that series of plot developments in such a way where Archer asked Erica if he could see the footage and she said yes. But they did not write the story that way. So that begs the question of what are they trying to say about Archer as a character, and how does that tie into this larger thematic pattern of the film? Archer loves his son and is desperately working hard to try to find him. That's good. But he's also manipulative and he is willing to violate boundaries. And in particular, this was a woman's boundaries. And I reiterate that point because they could have swapped this series of events where it had been the father saying no to Archer, but then the mother says yes. But they didn't write the story in that way. So you are seemingly reiterating a particular attitude towards women, and possibly the story could be addressing a larger misogynistic societal attitude. The way that Justine Gandy is presumed to be the culprit of the children's disappearance, even though there's no actual evidence to indicate that, feels very reminiscent of any number of misogynistic witch hunts, if you will pardon the use of that expression, that have happened against various women. And I'm not going to give examples simply because I don't want to derail this discussion of a fictional film by unintentionally igniting the same misinformed misogyny against various women in the public eye who have been unjustly targeted with hate trains. Also, a detail I love is that there's this figurative witch hunt against Justine. The graffiti on her car said witch, but then it actually was a witch, or this film's version of a witch, who was responsible for everything. This witch element feels like another intentional through line, like the whole parasite/fungus on the ant thing. Is it suspicious that all of the missing children would be from one classroom? Sure. But there was no clear proof that it was her, and if you've seen the film, you know that it wasn't her. Justine's characterization was interesting to me because, on the one hand, you see how she's this flawed, wounded person with a drinking problem, but you also see how she genuinely cares about her students. They repeatedly make a point of showing her crouching down so that whenever she's speaking to Alex, who is one of her students, and he's also the only one who didn't go missing, she's never speaking down to him. So what I interpret from her arc is that she's representative of the people in that generation who do genuinely care. They can see that something's wrong, but they're simultaneously battered and damaged from the trauma of living in this world. And they also lack the tools or resources or knowledge of how to organize and make a real change and impact in the larger ecosystem. Even when Justine tries to say that something's wrong, she tries to report things, no one will listen to her. So this shows that the system of society at large is just fundamentally broken. There's no community here. I'm going to refrain from going on a whole long tangent about how toxic, individualistic cultural norms are, but that train of thought did impact how I observed and analyzed this story. If there was real community here, it wouldn't be just one person noticing these red flags in Alex's behavior, the disappearance of his parents from being out and about in the town, the newspapers covering the windows at his house. Who else notices that something's weird about the house? James. And his only conclusion is that that's a decent option for a house to rob. The system and culture at large is broken, and there is no official infrastructure or support system to help those children. When Justine was being violently chased by a magically murderous Marcus, the store owner makes zero attempt to try to help her. The only thing you hear him say is, "Get out of my store," because he feels inconvenienced by the mess that was made from the commotion of Archer crashing into Marcus to try to stop him. And Justine responds to this man, "Effing help me." You see what I mean? No community whatsoever. So we covered the oldest and the middle generation, so now we reach the younger generation. But mostly, this section is talking about Alex. When they finally got to his chapter, it was like this massive emotional gut punch, because that was not only when we began to get answers about what happened to the children, it's also when you really start to understand what this story is about. I know I've talked about symbolism in the story being applicable to systems of violent oppression constructed by generations of the past, but make no mistake, a large part of this story is first and foremost about abuse. In particular, there's a focus on this being within the family unit, though, of course, you can apply this to how that happens beyond just that one area of a child's life. In the film's trailer, you can see this glimpse of the opening to some sort of drain. Maybe it's a sewage drain. And the way that you see these glimpses of Gladys in the film before they properly introduce her, such as the shot of her waving at James in the woods, that one in particular felt very reminiscent of Stephen King's It, which is what? A story about a supernatural being that preys upon and eats children. Near the end of the film, when Alex's parents have been activated by Alex crossing that salt line, and they violently chase after Alex, they're partially breaking through doors, which feels like a clear homage to Stanley Kubrick's rendition of Stephen King's The Shining, which is a story about an abusive husband/parent. You see where we're going here? See, these don't feel like homages chosen simply because they're well-known horror stories and you are also making a horror film. There's a clear thematic overlap. By the way, I just posted my video about the Running Man book and a full trailer breakdown. That's another Stephen King adaptation. The book was originally published under a pseudonym, but it is still technically yet another Stephen King book. So feel free to go watch that as well. In both of my viewings of Weapons, there's definitely been an audible response to the more darkly comedic parts of the film. This is not accidental comedy, it's an intentional part of the narrative style. However, when keeping that in mind, when I got to the chapter where it's from Alex's point of view, especially on a second viewing, I was very aware of how there was no comedy. They don't bring back any of these darkly comedic elements of the narrative style until the perspective broadens out to include other adult characters, namely Justine and Archer, who show up to the house. For all of the various horror jump scares and other horror signatures in Weapons, the most harrowing part of this movie is a child, Alex, being harmed and threatened in his own home by a family member. When she matter-of-factly forbids him from telling anyone about her, threatening him into silence, and then him having to feed his own supernaturally catatonic parents, as well as all of those children who are being held hostage, nothing in this film was more devastating or frightening to watch than that. Now, before I continue talking about the material and analyzing it, I do want to take a moment to praise Amy Madigan and name her explicitly because she's an icon and she acted the hell out of this role. I'm obsessed with how fabulous her performance was. Deeply disturbing, of course, given everything I just said about the material, but the skill set she was showing as a performer, that was the type of performance that makes me more excited about the craft of acting. And for people who didn't understand why I was bringing up the rat Elia Kazan in my previous video, she and her husband Ed Harris, they refused to applaud him at the Academy Awards, and they were iconic for that. And Orson Welles was also included because he has this super popular clip that regularly goes viral, and it lives in my head rent-free, where he was dragging Elia Kazan for being a rat. But anyway, now back to Weapons and more specifically Alex. This young boy is the one to save the day. He is the one to liberate the children. And when I reflect on that, immediately the quote that came to mind is the one from the Black Panther, Huey Newton, where he said, "The revolution has always been in the hands of the young. The young always inherit the revolution." Now again, I will reiterate that I am not claiming that my interpretation of the film is identical to the explicit intention of the creator of the story, Zach Cregger. I don't know if he reads revolutionary literature, and I'm not going to presume such a thing to be true. But that's simply a quote that I've thought about quite a bit, and it stayed with me, so when I saw Alex save the day and I began to try to analyze the story, it was a quote that came to mind. How did Alex save the day? Well, for one, it was a matter of life or death. He tried going along with the system that he was forcibly coerced and threatened into following, and none of the false promises came through. Gladys had lied and acted as if him helping her to bring those classmates to her would make her leave. But then she stayed and continued on with her violent, tyrannical ways. But Alex had observed her pattern of behavior. He had studied the tools and tactics of his oppressor, though that's admittedly a far more grandiose way of describing it. But he saw that, he learned her playbook, so to speak, and he turned that against her to free those children and weaponize her own methodology and captives against her, to her own demise. And what's so important about that is that he didn't learn those tactics and then continue to use them for his own gain. He only attacked the oppressor, after which everyone was free, which was all he wanted. Not power, but freedom. And this is where I need to bring in a real world part of this. I don't want to overly discuss this because it's a real thing that involves real people, but after seeing the film for the first time, at which point I no longer had to worry about spoilers, I did a brief bit of looking around and I found out that Zach Cregger has been interviewed for an investigative piece about a serial predator, or I suppose I'm legally required to say alleged predator, who targeted children. From what I could gather, the quotes in which Zach was named indicate that he was interviewed from the perspective of having many friends or peers who were directly affected, as opposed to Zach himself being one of the ones who was directly affected. The article is paywalled, but I read it using the Wayback Machine, so you can use that as well if you would like to read through it. There is no way for me to rewatch Weapons or even Barbarian, the latter of which also presented more than one man in the story who violates others in that way, and not interpret that this thing that happened in close proximity to Zach Cregger had a profound impact on him. And as a natural outcome, he seems to feel very strongly about that subject matter, and that's why it has had this recurring presence across his first two feature films that he has made as a director/screenwriter. It would also potentially explain this distrust for the systems at large and the police in particular, because the predator that is talked about in that article, he never went to jail for his alleged crimes. Now, all things considered, I think Weapons is a very well-constructed story with a lot of layers to it, and based on my estimation of those first two films, I'm interested in seeing whatever Zach Cregger would like to do next.